Welcome to the Roundtable at Pulaski Heights United Methodist Church, a podcast of discussions with substance. Join our staff and leaders of our church as we journey through topics that inform, engage, and inspire the daily life of our church.
Welcome to the Roundtable with Pulaski Heights United Methodist Church. We're so glad that you are here. I'm Kathleen McMurray. I am the pastor of Connecting Ministries and Worship here at the church.
Hi, I'm Abbey Maynard. I'm the pastor of Community Ministries.
My name is Jay Clark, and I'm the executive pastor here at Pulaski Heights.
And I'm John Robbins, the senior pastor here at Pulaski Heights.
Today we are going to be talking about how we as church members and church leaders live out our public faith. And so I wanted to start out by saying there's a lot of discussion right now about recent Supreme Court decisions and church and state, and certainly we live in a country that has Christianity as a majority religion-ish, but we also live in a country that has freedom of religion. And so I wanted to ask, what do you think the effects are on the church when we have a separation of church and state versus not? Like, what are the effects on religion when you have a religious state? How does that affect the religious, the way that people live out their religion? And then when you don't have a religious state, how does that change the way that religion looks? Jay?
Formulating.
How about if I say
Yes,
something?
John.
Thank you. While Jay formulates.
Yes.
Don't do it on me, please. I think it's always important to have separation of church and state. I don't want to be a part of something that dictates to me what it is I have to say or punishes me if I don't say it or say something that they don't consider to be appropriate. So to me, I think separation of church and state is very, very important. I think in many countries where state rules government, you have all kinds of persecution and you have all kinds of agendas that get in the way of the ultimate message that's trying to be conveyed from the religious standpoint. So I appreciate the fact that we live in a nation where there is separation of church and state. I do wish the church had a little more influence over what some of the things that are happening within our nation, and I think at one time the church did, and we're losing some of that influence, and hopefully over time we can regain it. But I'm very much a believer in separation of church and state for a variety of reasons. I think that's very, very important.
I'm not just piggyback off that. The current state of, let's talk about the current state of Christianity. I'm not sure that I want them to have where we are right now as a nation. I'm not sure I want them to have any more a voice. But then that goes because sometimes I don't agree with them, and we don't like it when people push back that we don't agree with. And we see that within our own denomination now, that there are some voices that are coming up that they want more control over spoon-feeding their people. And that's something that we in the United Methodist Church have always prided ourselves on, is that we don't spoon-feed. And we do have people who can think, and we do have people who can disagree. And the whole separation of church and state, it always comes up, especially in the church, on holidays.
Right.
That some people expect the flag to be in the sanctuary. And there are some churches that always have the flag in the sanctuary. Right. And so to me, it really doesn't bother me because it's a reminder that we are separate. But we honor, those who have gone before us for freedom in our country and things like that. But I guess you can rationalize it any way you want to twist it. But anyway, those are just a few of my thoughts.
Abby?
Yeah, I also really believe in a separation of church and state, also for the sake of the church, because our highest authority is God, and that is, what we answer to. And oftentimes, a government can become a people-serving authority. And so for the sake of the church, not just for the sake of the government and the country as a whole, for us to keep in mind what is most important and who is most important, I think it's important to keep us separate so that we aren't just letting our church also be run by politics or by things like that.
Right. It was really interesting. I had the opportunity to live, I lived in Thailand for 9 months. And Thailand is a country that is majority Buddhist. and only about 5% of the population is Christian. But I have to say that when I would go to Christian churches, and I preached in some churches with translators, which is a whole interesting experience for sure. But as I would go and experience what Christianity looks like in that kind of situation, it looks so very different. But I was so drawn to it because in many ways it looked a lot like what I hear the early church looking like in Acts, as far as just community being essential and people seeking to, live in this world that is very different from what their religion says. And it was just a really beautiful thing to behold. So I think like you said, Abby, that we can, the church as a whole, I think, can grow and was meant to grow separate from politics and power of humans, and that our ultimate authority is in that. Have you had any experience where there has been tension maybe between your, Michael, time out. What was the actual question? You never...
Oh yeah, it didn't get fleshed out.
Tension between kind of like a tension between like church and state, like the secular world and
Okay. Sorry.
Alright.
Thank you, my editors. So have you had any experience where there's a tension between the secular world and the church, or the church and state, where there's tension there? I mean, Jay, you sort of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but where is that tension, and how do we navigate that?
One of the things that always makes me think of is when they first outlawed prayer in school, and everyone just got in a tizzy about it. And I was like, well, you didn't get in a tizzy because you could pray, and did you take advantage of praying when you were in, school? And this one, I worked in a church, and they, the big thing, and still at some schools, football games have the prayer before the football game. Well, this was the first football game after they said that, they couldn't pray before the game. Well, there was a church that was right next door to the football field that went up on their roof with a loudspeaker and a microphone and blasted this prayer from the roof of the church. And I just remember sitting there in that football game thinking, this is dumb. The old saying of, if you don't think there's prayer in schools, you've never taken a test, you've never seen a student, before the test. So I don't know. I mean, I try not to get that. That's one way that I thought, that this is just we get caught up in it.
I actually lived in a community where they had prayer before the football games, and then the school board ruled that they could no longer have prayer. And the leader of the group in opposition to the school board decision was a member of my church. He was outraged that we didn't have prayer before the games. And I saw him at a community event, and he said, I'm offended that you're not outraged we don't have prayer before games anymore. And I said, I'm offended that you're offended about not having prayer before games, but you never come to church and don't contribute. So let's put things in proper perspective. And I think sometimes we become a caricature of ourselves, and we don't, we get on board with some issue because it enables us to be visibly faithful. And I think the fact of the matter is sometimes I think God frowns on that. A prayer is appropriate. It's necessary. We are a people of prayer. But when we mock what prayer stands for and what it ultimately is about, then to me, that's an issue that we have to address. And standing up with a microphone, blurting out a prayer, is comical because it actually denigrates the sacredness of prayer.
Well, and there's no, even when, there was no official prayer in school led over the loudspeakers, you can still sit down at the lunch table and say a prayer before you eat in the cafeteria. There's nothing preventing children from praying. In fact, there was a previous church that I served where there was a group of our youth that started a little Bible study at lunch. And it was just the youth doing that. And
did they stand up and say, "We're having Bible study"?
no, they didn't. But they ended up bringing some other youth to Christ through this experience, but it was not over a loudspeaker.
Right.
It was done through relationships and through just small intentional ways. What do you think, Abby?
I don't know that I've had such a direct way of seeing those in conflict, at least in my life, but one in particular is, we in the church talk about the importance of taking care of the least of these, and we talk about our values, and we want that to be, what influences our politics and how we vote. And oftentimes politicians will use being a Christian as part of their platform. And so as part of that, I feel like, if they're going to say they have those values, they should have those values. And I was on a trip with the United Methodist Church a few years ago to D.C., where we got to meet with, actually Jay was on that trip as well, where we got to meet with some of our leaders about childhood hunger in Arkansas, which is a very serious issue. And it was really interesting for me to see that some of our politicians were really interested in listening to the students and the concerns from young people in their own state who are coming to them as fellow Christians and saying, these are things we are concerned about for these, socioeconomic reasons and for these spiritual reasons. And it was interesting to see that some of them did respond to that. Some of them were interested. And some of them who say that they are, a Christian and that's part of their big platform gave us no time and weren't interested in listening to something that I felt like was a really serious, problem for the church community and for Christians in general.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to my next question. The United Methodist Church has this history of tension when it comes to social issues and social advocacy. We have social principles in our book of discipline that talks about things like climate change and labor and these issues and hunger and child rights and lots of different things that are social issues and that affect people. What should the church's role be? Dr. Robbins, you mentioned, us wanting the church to have a stronger role in making decisions. What should the church's role be in this separation of church and state when it comes to social issues that our politicians have something to say about?
Well, I think the church has to take a stand, and whatever that may be from our perspective, which quite frankly is not always the same perspective denominationally,
Right.
and what it is we believe about what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. The social principles have all kinds of, you're right, they have climate change, but it also talks about gambling, it talks about smoking and drinking and all of those kind of things. And what I appreciate about the social principles, at least it says this is what we believe. Now, quite frankly, I don't believe all of that in the social principles. There are some things that I disagree with, but they're not scriptural. They're a guideline or a road that leads us down a path to understand why we as United Methodists would collectively take a stand on a particular issue. For example, the gambling issue has to do with the fact that in the social principles that a lot of people have an addiction to gambling and become a real problem. As a result, they'll spend money on gambling instead of feeding their children, things like that. And on drinking, people who drink
Right.
too much, and those smoking, obviously for health reasons and that kind of thing. But at the same time, those are guidelines, if you will, about what it is we fundamentally believe, even though we may not agree with all of it in terms of how it's applicable to our lives. And I think what's really important for the church is just to take a stand on something with regard to what it is we think Jesus Christ would have us do. I think a lot of times over the years in the church is we're so fearful that we're going to be divisive, and there are obviously divisive issues, or that we're going to be offending the wrong people in the church or the community or whatever. And I think clearly Jesus offended lots of people. They offended them to the point
Right.
that they put him to death. And I don't need to die for the church. Jesus already did that. But I do think there are times when we just need to say, this is who we are and this is what we believe. And most of the time, those are fundamentals. We don't get a lot of argument about some of those kind of things. But there are issues on the flip side that a lot of times people will, gun control, for example, where people will be very adamant and take a firm stand one way or another on that, and we have to ask ourselves just personally where we stand on that as a follower of Jesus Christ.
So, Abby, you mentioned, going and speaking to politicians in this trip to D.C. How did that fit in with this question of the church's role within the government?
So, for me, I do think that the separation of church and state is important. But I also think that it needs to be a conversation, because even if the church obviously the church is not the ruling body, but the people of the church are still the constituents of the state. And so the things that we believe, the things that are serious concerns to us, should be things that, like you said, we should take a stand on. We should make, our opinion known. We shouldn't have the right to just dictate for the world what should happen. But we should still be able to stand up and say, these are the things that we believe, these are the things that we care about. And just like other communities of faith would be expected to do that as well, that we should say, this is what is important to us. This is what we represent as part of this country and as part of this democracy.
Yeah. One of the things that's interesting about that trip to Washington when we met with our Congress people, one of them in particular that I usually disagree with on everything politically, but he said, we love church, groups because you all, do so much. We need you to do more. And so, but the counter was, there has to be some government social services too. It's not just you do this and we'll sit back and watch. But, we get into that. I mean, I have this argument every year with people that it's not a all or nothing. That,
Right.
Everything, yes, there are people who are going to milk the system.
Right.
There always will be.
Mm-hmm.
But for the person who just needs a leg up and then honestly tries their hardest to work for their family, that person could use help from the church and from the government. Mm-hmm. And that's one way that we would see us working together, but some people don't see it that way.
But that's exactly what grace calls us to do, to help, even if they might take advantage of it.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
Not on my time, though.
Thank you so much for joining us with our Pulaski Heights Roundtable. We are thankful for your presence, and we hope that you will join us again. So have a great week, and tell someone about Pulaski Heights United Methodist Church.